Okay, I'd like to get started again here. As a lot of you have probably noticed, as an industry, we're in sort of a transition. We're moving from what I think was for a lot of us a hobby into what is for nearly all of us a business and hopefully a future. And as we move through that transition, figuring out how to make a business work, how to do the things to make a successful business are the questions most of us is trying to answer. Yes. So this next discussion is basically aimed at trying to deal with those sorts of issues. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jim Polyspace from Washington, D.C., who will introduce you to the rest of the people up here. Thanks.
Well, as Jeff reminds me, just because I'm a moderator doesn't mean that anyone should assume that I'm a moderate. So all of us, for most of you, any of you who don't know my background, I've worked primarily for the last 25 years in space policy, a lot of it in government service and a lot of it in the not-for-profit advocacy community, and only really in the last 6 years consulting, actually working with businesses, primarily entrepreneurial businesses. And I have to say that this last 6 years has been quite an adventure because I've been learning a little bit of business, sort of experiencing it, albeit from the perspective of government relations and advocacy and things like, helping businesses with regulatory concerns and things like that. But it's been fascinating. And it is a different world. It is so different than the world of government I came from. It's just amazing. I'm here not as a moderator because I have any expertise in business, but as like I hope many of you, as a willing learner and student. And today's opportunity is to learn from successful business executives who have been through the ropes, who have been through the hot coals of capitalism, in different business ventures, and successfully so, and have come and here to share with us really the experience that they've been through. It is not surprising that the businesses that they've been engaged in space were businesses that involved beaming electrons around, because that's what's profitable in space right now. Massless product is what makes money. Because the cost of getting there and the regularity of getting there is just so hard that unless you can set up a transaction that doesn't involve transportation of something, it just isn't worth it. Now, space, of course, can provide value-added services, but that's terrestrial transportation, not space transportation. The old joke, if you want to make $1 million in space, start with $1 billion, still holds true, by and large. I'm pleased to know both of our panelists today. I'm going to introduce the one I know a little least, not as well, first. Levin is the Chief Strategic Officer for Transformational Space Corporation, or T-Space. He was one of the 6. They're one of course, a finalist for NASA's COTS program. He's not going to be talking about T-Space today. He is the co-founder of XM Satellite Radio, a company many of you are very familiar with in your automobiles or in your XM to go digital players. And I'm sorry, it's really small. By helping to set up this and other space-based businesses, including Mobile Satellite Ventures, American Mobile Satellite Corporation, and TerraStar Networks, as well as XM Canada. He is bringing to bear a lot of expertise in very successful space-based businesses that, as we start to move the transportation sector from, as Jeff said, a hobbyist or a failing business venture sector into a successful sector, we can learn from. So with that, Levin.
Thank you. I'm going to speak about 5 minutes and then hand it over to my colleague TerreStar Networks, and then we're going to take questions and answers. I know that there's some people in the press here. I would prefer that you don't quote me from here. If you do want to speak with me after, I'm happy to speak with you. But the reason I ask for that is because I want to dialogue with the audience, and I don't want to be thinking about what the quotes are going to be. Let's talk quickly about business in space. I have been extraordinarily privileged to be in the space business for most of my career, which started in 1980. And during that time, I indeed have made money in the space businesses. Also, money has been lost as well. But by and large, the fact that I'm employed by space businesses the entire time. Let's first talk about what you have to deal with when you are getting into a space-based business. Schopenhauer, the philosopher, talks about truth, and he talks about the three phases of anything that becomes true in a society. The first is that when the statements are made, or the observations are made, first there's ridicule, and then after comes hostility to that idea, and then the idea becomes self-evident. Well, that's been my experience in any space-based venture that I have been part of. And the one that I know you know most about is XM Radio. When we first came up with the idea, this was in 1990, 92, you can imagine that there was extraordinary ridicule. Who wants radio? Who wants to pay for radio? Who's going to pull out their radio and put in a new one? Spend $1.5 billion before you get anywhere, and then you turn on the switch, and then you see if it works. There really was just, ridicule is a mild word for what I had to deal with a few others who believed in it. And then, and this is when you know you're onto something, comes a hostility from the entrenched interests. The National Association of Broadcasters established their own special committee, just truly, a separate committee that was dedicated to stopping satellite radio from going forward. And that was through the 90s. And now it's here. And now it's self-evident. It does make sense. People do want to have radio that goes from coast to coast. They are willing to pay for it. We have 10 million subscribers, and this is a space-based business. It has aspects of it that are terrestrial-based, but we came up with a model that assures that business. Let me tell you why I think XM worked and why some space businesses do not work. With XM, there was always a clear vision, and we never wavered. And if I can give you the metaphor that always seems to work for me, is that you need a star that you're heading for, and the business is a ship. You can get buffeted around, the weather can be bad, but if the star is clear, you will get there. You're going to struggle with your financing, struggle with your technology, but if it makes sense, you will eventually get there. If you find that you're going off course a lot, and you're just going in some other direction because it's not working out, you're going in some other direction. I'm not saying that you shouldn't change course if it's not working out, but if you're doing that a lot, then you should question whether the business was right. With XM, from the day we began, it was the same idea. It was going to be extraordinary quality. FM was still analog, it hadn't changed, but CDs were here and something else was even going to come that was better. We had to have that high quality digital sound. 2, it was going to be ubiquitous. Wherever you went, you were going to get the radio. One of the problems with terrestrial radio has been that it fades in and out. We were going to overcome that. And the third thing was, it was going to be overwhelming amount of choice. And now you have the 160 channels. Wherever you go, you have all the baseball games you want. You have 60, 70 channels of music. Sirius does the same thing. They have great quality programming as well. And an extraordinary choice, extraordinary quality. And it never changed. Yeah, it cost $1.5 billion, $2 billion later, each company, thousands of people working on the project. It grew and it grew, but it was always the same idea. And I'm going to conclude with that. We can take questions and answers. As I have been involved with the mobile satellite service industry, with American Mobile Satellite and TerreStar Networks, which you'll hear about, and Mobile Satellite Ventures. And now I'm with T-Space. I can talk about that generally. You know that we're in a competition for COTS. We're one of the 6 finalists. And so I've got to be careful what I can talk about, but I'm certainly happy to share with you some general observations about what NASA is doing, which I think is terrific. And that's it for now, and look forward to your questions and being able to answer.
Okay, the next panelist is Jim Frelk. I'll read your title. Senior Vice President for Government Services for TerraStar Networks. But I've known Jim for over 20 years. Jim and I met actually because he started out in the policy government community just as I did, working when he was a strategic defense and security analyst in Congress for the House Republican Study Committee. He went on to run an organization called the George C. Marshall Institute, many of you are familiar with, is really an excellent think tank based in Washington that does a lot of work in science policy. He then rejoined the government as the director of the Office of Space Commercialization at the Department of Commerce in 1991 and was there for 2 years. He then took another trip back into industry, working at Lockheed, and was involved in space imaging creation and then digital. Were you at Digital Globe?
Yep.
And then directly to Earthwatch, which later became Digital Globe. Jim came back into the government a few years ago to join NASA when Courtney Stadd was the chief of staff for Sean O'Keefe. Most recently, just a few months ago, left NASA to join TerraStar Networks. Jim is somewhere between Lon and I. Lon's been in the business world totally. Jim has in fact erred by having some public service credentials in his portfolio, but he is, I think, primarily a businessman, and I'm only just a recovering government employee. So, Jim.
It's great to be here with you guys to talk about some observations over the years working really in the private sector, and as well as working in the government, because at times the government can be a customer, sometimes a better customer, sometimes a worse customer in dealing with for the private sector. And really many years involved in what would be called commerce, or trying to commercialize activities in space, and both sides again in the government trying to clear the regulatory and legal underbrush that needs to be cleared for commercial to thrive, as well as working in the private sector and trying to build businesses and business activities that generate wealth for investors, jobs for employees, and services for folks not only in the United States but globally, because the very nature of the aerospace and the space business is that it tends to have a potential for obviously a global reach. So I'm going to try to provide just briefly some observations, and these are really just observations. And other folks are going to have different experiences and really in building and starting up businesses in aerospace and in space in general. And these are my own, so I'll tell you up front that there may be some prejudice just from exposure in the things that I've done. And there's no one way of doing things that's the right way. I think there are many paths to success. But just some basic observations that I would have relative to things that seem to work a bit better and things that didn't work so good. Frankly speaking, in doing financial raises for, let's say, remote sensing companies like Earthwatch at the time and others, what you quickly realize in dealing with financial investors, Wall Street, the guys who, quote, run the widow and pension funds, is that they're looking at a lot of opportunities that have, frankly, good technology involved. The entities are trying to address a particular market segment that seems to have some potential for generating revenue for the company and appropriate returns. But the differentiator that I found amongst all the analysts is they always wanted to, as they got more serious in investing in you, to meet the management team and the people who are actually going to be executing on the business plan. Part of it is they realized initial business plans were written for financing purposes and provide that initial guiding star for the organization. But they also realized that it was the team in executing that may have to modify what it was going to be doing with practical experience over time that was either going to make or break the organization. So at the end of the day, they really want to look people in the eyes, get a feel for their performance record and how they managed to see if these guys really were going to be able to execute and create the kind of return that they were looking for. And so I'll say that the key to success, at least from my perspective, in any business activity, but in particularly in the area of space, is people, people, people. It's people who execute. You can have a great business plan, you can have great technology, you can have a great marketplace, but poor execution by people will literally kill a business. And even when you have those things, those three basic ingredients, people, technology, and a marketplace that needs addressing, you can still get killed as an organization by things you can't even see that are coming. The other thing, as an observation, in space, the development of activities tends to take a bit of time. Unlike other business sectors where you can put some almost immediate capability into place, begin generating revenue, and step into a capability, a lot of times you're talking about building a satellite that takes 36 months to 5 years to build, to develop a capability of generating revenue off those activities. And so it requires you not only to develop a business plan for today, but 3 to 5 years from now. And oftentimes there are market reactions that take place that you may not be clairvoyant in seeing. I mean, look at, to a certain extent, our colleagues at Iridium. They had an initial business plan. In talking to other executives, they attribute a lot of the change that took place to the Iridium business plan due to fiber optics going into the developing countries. Different ways of moving data, wireless communication networks through a terrestrial. A lot of the marketplace that Iridium thought they were going to be able to address modified rapidly between the time they started designing the satellites and the operational capability and the time they actually had it generating revenue. So there's always going to be a market reaction. And that's why, while there needs to be a guiding star, I agree with Lon for the organization, you better have a good guiding star to start with, and you better plan for one that in fact is 3 years from now, if you have that long lead time. Whenever the other thing that I think is important, and I was admiring Mr. Bigelow this morning because he seems to be doing it the right way, is to take things a step at a time, meaning that if you can at all begin developing capabilities and testing the marketplace early before your full operational capability is developed, that helps validate a lot of things, shake some things out. And particularly in the areas where you're dealing with what I'll call mass markets, it begins getting you used to the kind of market getting into in a practical way. So it's not just theoretical in a business plan, it becomes very practical. Again, some other observations here. I mean, there's always opportunity to work with the government on a lot of these space-related activities. They seem to gravitate toward government to the extent that there's a healthy mix of activities, or in some cases dealing with commercial customers. I think it's really healthy for the commercial space industry and the growth of the commercial space industry to be so dependent upon the government for existence as organizations. That being said, I think that a lot of work needs to be done, not so much in injecting the government into commercial space activities, but helping the government develop practices, whether it's contracting practices, whether it's regulatory practices. This morning ITAR was talked about, and some other things, that in fact creates a favorable environment for doing business with the government. It's really important to be a good supplier as a provider of services to both commercial and government customers, but it's also really important for the government to learn how to be a good consumer, a good customer of those products and services in a way that allows for natural growth and evolution and development rather than there being a stifling effect that's happen because of other legitimate concerns they may have. I'm not going to go on much longer, but again, some of the observations here, frankly, from even working at the Office of Space Commerce and watching companies develop business plans, try to market those international, try to develop financing activities, all the things that are necessary to get a business started and for it to be successful, and the natural competition that's there internationally, I must tell you guys at the end of the day that you see a lot of failure, not just in space commerce, but in businesses in general. Most businesses fail, the vast majority do once they're started. And that shouldn't be a discouragement. It just means that you need to refine the method that you're using to invest money and to start the businesses. A lot of hearts are broken and have been broken and are broken in space commerce. I think some of the developments I've seen over the years in the kind of focus, things like XM radio, things like wireless and network communication using satellite, the entire communication industry, things like GPS and the development of applications in GPS, even in remote sensing, although I still think it's fairly dominated by government customers, I think are healthy developments in going forward. But there are some fundamental impediments that are still there. The cost of launching things into space and doing business in space is still a significant barrier, which means that if you're looking at niche business or niche market segments, you may not have the potential in market to satisfy the high costs and the high risks that are associated with it. Recently, I was at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce session by the Space Enterprise Council, and there's some very bright folks that look at market developments and investments and relative return on investment, and risk. And they were pointing out that, frankly, aerospace, this is not just space commerce, but aerospace in general, had risks that were equal to or getting close to pharmaceutical firms. Pharmaceutical firms and the biological areas in development frankly have been generating a return on investment on average that's much higher than the Dow average return over 10 years, or 5 years, over 2 years, whatever you looked at it. And aerospace in general, the large aerospace companies and aerospace activities, has been underperforming the Dow in return. And so just from a marketplace perspective, it doesn't apply to everybody, but the way that the financial markets look at it is, where can I put my money to generate a return on investment that's better than the Dow? That's what everybody wants to do. That's what your fund managers are trying to do if you have 401ks. And unless you can get into business areas that do that from a mass market potential, you won't attract the kind of capital that's necessary, the high cost of capital in doing business in space. Other side of that is the development and technology that may be a role for government, things that the private sector wouldn't necessarily be involved in, that in fact could reduce the potential costs of getting things in space, which is still, I think, a major impediment. With that, I'll leave it to questions you guys may have for both Lon and myself. Okay?
So now I guess I do the moderator part. I'm going to take the moderator of asking the first question. One could say that the new space industry, broadly defined, is divided up into two camps. One camp are companies that are interested in pursuing purely private markets, okay? They don't want to have anything to do with NASA, okay? They would prefer, as nice as George Neal is at FAA, they would, they'll deal with FAA to the extent they have to, or the Office of Space Commercialization and Commerce if they have to, but they really don't want to deal with the government if they can avoid it. They just want to go sell to private customers because they have faith that private customers will buy. The other part of the new space industry is either interested in doing something so big and difficult that it requires more financing and therefore requires really a very significant to come in with development funding, like a government as a partner, or they're interested in doing things that really directly interrelate with or even conflict with things NASA is doing or DoD is doing. To pick either one of those and suggest what the strengths and weaknesses of that approach are, okay? In other words, what's good about going the private route, what's not good about going the purely private route, and what's, and I'll throw it open to either one of you.
First, that's
fine. Yeah, it's working. I think really in both cases, Jim, what you're trying to do is generate a customer base and a way of doing business that allows you to generate the kind of revenues in the way you need to generate revenues. On the financing side, I don't really think it's a great idea to count on the government as a financer of activities. I've never thought that for a commercial practice. There are financial markets that do this professionally and are frankly, in some ways, much more predictable than the government is in that process. The commercial, the strictly private sector market can be as tough, if not tougher, than the government in different ways. And so understanding your customer becomes very important. Those guys that understand government contracting and the flexibility in contracting and what needs to change in government contracting to make things better are companies that are doing business with the government because it really makes businesses more effective, more profitable, and really have longer-term prospects for success. That's also true in the private sector. The changes fairly rapidly with market development. So there's a different set of skills that go into both. When you deal in the quasi-world of satisfying both government and private sector customers, I think it becomes important in having a model of not only products and services but delivery that frankly bridges the two in some significant ways. If it doesn't up front, you're better off having two separate business entities, even if there's an umbrella holding company, because it's so different in dealing with those two customers. But if there's enough of a similarity that it makes sense and it's strictly pragmatic, you need to understand that up front relative to your product and service delivery model. If you're into a project sales activity, as an example, even in the private sector, that has a 1 year or 2 year or even a 3-year sales cycle, it's going to be very similar to the federal government process in developing that, the customer requirements up front, getting them to adopt that in a budgeting sense for large organizations. And truly, right. I think that the thing that I discovered was really in talking to Jim Webb before he passed away, was that he viewed large organizations as large organizations that became fairly bureaucratic and difficult to deal with as customers. And so he dealt, in his mind, it was large organizations versus smaller organizations. It gets really into customer types. So I guess from my perspective, I think that selling to the private sector, if that makes sense, based upon the product and service you're providing, great. Make sure you understand the risks associated with doing so, the developments that can take place, and how you need to develop the kind of team, the kind of service you need to provide, the kind of contracting vehicles or payment vehicles for that service that makes some sense where you're going. Same thing is obviously true on the government side. And for those that are doing a bit of both, where it makes sense, I think there's a little bit more of a challenge in making sure that up front you understand the business model and you're offering very, very well, and how are you going to generate the revenues that you're going to generate. Because there is an additional cost of doing business when you're dealing at times with larger organizations and you're doing project sales. Because frankly, you have to invest a lot of business development money up front before you get a return on investment. It's different than when you have maybe a commodities business, what I call the Coke machine business, where people are just throwing the in there and the can's coming out and you're doing great.
Right. Lon?
Yeah, I do understand your question. From my perspective, business is business, and all customers have their challenges, whether you got to sell to someone in Best Buy, make them buy it and take out an ad, or it's the government. But there's another part of your question that I want to deal with, and that's government versus non-government, and sometimes the way we think. First, in full disclosure, my first job for 3.5 years was at the Federal Communications Commission. So in fact, I did work for the government, and I loved it, and hopefully one day
and you seem to have recovered from the experience.
No, actually, I'd love to go back one day, eventually. I'm not looking for a job right now. T-Space is just fine, but I would like to do it one day again. They were great years. Anyway, I do think when it comes to space, the government is involved. And I think that for anyone in space-based businesses, including the ones XM or MSV, TerraStar, whatever, there is a large government component, because in order to launch something into space, you have to look at it from two perspectives. One, the legacy of space. The legacy of space, any new frontier in human history, you begin with governments looking into it, whether it's the New World or it's space. Governments are the only ones who will take the risk in the beginning. So even though there may be private launchers and private satellites now, the fact is that there was one time when there weren't. It just didn't exist. It was the government funding rocketry. It was the government putting satellites into space. And then it became obvious that if government can do it, then maybe it can be transferred over to the private sector. And now I'm going to what I see in low Earth orbit. I think we're seeing that migration right now in general, that we're about to be part of. the migration from the government operating in low Earth orbit to the private sector taking over some of those roles. That's why there's a COTS program. That's why there are other programs that are taking place. That's why Bigelow launched what he did and is after that market. Low Earth orbit is now the next place for the private sector to go, but it would not have been possible had the government not done it first.
Sure. Okay, next question. Is there a mic?
We can get one, but it won't
No.
be ready.
That's
by
okay.
Just yell it out,
we'll
David.
we'll just
David?
repeat the questions.
Yeah, I'd like both of you to comment on this if you would. We finally, after several years of vacancy, have Department of Space Commerce Space Commercialization Office head again, and I think they're still down to only 2 people in secretary at the moment. I'm not quite sure, but this 2006 changed, both good and bad, a lot of it for the good. What do you two think if you have the head of that office here right now? And I don't know the guy. Assume for a moment that he's pure of heart. Willing to do the right thing, go fight for it if someone convinces him of it, sort of thing, and not just a Republican hacker or something. What are the 1, 2, or 3 things you would tell him that the next year, 2 years, if he really gets done, he should consider that his tenure was a success?
Guys?
Again, I want to be a little bit careful, because any advice I would give to Ed Morris, I would probably want to give to him directly as to what he should, since I was a prior director of that office. I can tell you, what's that? What I would tell you is that really that office has played a key role over the years in doing a couple things I think are really important for commercial space. One is from really a federal government perspective, not just Commerce Department, but a federal government perspective, being the voice for industry in the interagency process relative to those, what I call the underbrush of regulatory, legal, or other issues, trade issues, that frankly create an impediment for commercial space to move forward. So one of the things that office has done well over the years as a service to the American people and really to industry has been to focus on those issues and representing in an important and significant way those folks in the interagency process. We wouldn't have a commercial remote sensing industry, frankly, today without that office taking the initiative, as Courtney will know, with the interagency folks, with the office, the Space Council, and the law to allow for commercial to go forward, which was an impediment from a legal and regulatory perspective for commercial to be even involved in remote sensing. The other thing I think that office has done over the years is really from a perspective of analysis. A lot of times there are offices within the government that provide estimates and forecasting that are very important that only the government can do, almost like a market research firm would do. And they over the years they've had what I would call a very good ability to deal with a lot of areas of industry and the government, and keeping track of developments, whether on the satellite side or the launch vehicle side or the services side, and documenting where the trends are. That helps financial markets make investment. Also mapping that to where government needs may be in the future also becomes very important. I think also, my experience in working at office, just as a government person, to listen and learn from the guys who are at the pointing of the stick in the private sector, who are trying to make a business out of the activities they have in front of them, with the challenges that they're facing, from everything to intellectual property rights protection, all the way through to ITAR concerns and being able to do things internationally with unfair, competition potentially as a result. And I think if that office continues to focus on that and has the support of the senior leadership at the Commerce Department, but also the respective colleagues in the interagency process, they'll provide a valuable service. I don't know if that answers your question.
Can we get some questions also focused in on business experience?
But
Thanks.
anyway,
I'm sorry. Go. I'm sorry, Lon.
I'm happy to answer from a business perspective,
Okay.
because I think that's a very good question, and that is, what can a government office set up to promote business in space do? Well, they provide a very, very valuable role. I already said, government and space are interrelated. There are a lot of government regulations, regardless of whether you're selling, again, to someone in Best Buy, there's an awful lot of government regulations you need to deal with. And then when you're trying to get something going, like an XM or an MSV, TerraStar, T-Space, whatever, you have companies that don't want you to succeed. They have entrenched interests that don't want you to succeed. So what you can get out of a space commercialization entity is become your advocate within to the other agencies, because they have the credibility where you are obviously pushing your own self-interest. Sure, they're pushing an obvious interest too, which is space commercialization, but they're doing it from a perspective of promoting capitalism, promoting additional entities to go forward, not necessarily taking your side, but taking an industry side and pushing hard. So for example, if you're up against the National Association of Broadcasters, you have the Office of Space Commercialization coming in to the FCC and saying, this is good for space. You have them going to Congress, because NAB is the most powerful lobby in the United States. They're trying to kill it in Congress. Then you have the Office of Space Commercialization coming in saying, this is not a healthy thing for space business. And what they do is they end up neutralizing the issue on the political side so that the decision makers administrative side, like the FCC, can simply go ahead and make their decision. That really is the most critical role they can play, which is an advocate within the government. The second place is they can be an advocate to the public, for example, on Wall Street or whatever, where you can tell someone who's looking to invest in you, why don't you give these guys a call? And they are perceived as more objective. Indeed, they are more objective, and I always find that to be helpful as well.
Great, thank you. Next question. Back.
What's your experience in terms of time from idea, time to implementation, and what were the biggest hurdles in getting towards the various options?
You want to repeat it?
Yeah, the question was, if I'm hearing correctly from the back there, that from time of conception to time of beginning to execute, having an operational capability, how long was it? What were the impediments, the biggest challenges to getting there? Correct? Again, my experience, when you build a satellite, getting it built under 36 months, 31 months, 30 months is a challenge. I mean, you're talking about a 3-year process normally to get a capability from design and build. Now, conceptually, when you say from concept, it's even before then, because you have to have a set of requirements. You're now into 4 years, maybe 5 years, if it's a satellite that you're putting up that's providing a service. Now, part of this is not necessarily building a new satellite to create a business. Part of it's maybe taking advantage of an existing capability, combining things together and creating a different product set. GPS is a good example of that. Remote sensing is a good example of that. And I think in almost all cases now in business, there are organizations that are looking at not only providing a commodity business of some sort, which is kind of the bulk remote sensing data or the bulk communication data, but getting into what I would call the value-added content, where there maybe is not as high gross revenues, potentially higher profit margins. And that you get into the higher valuable things, which Jim pointed out is information, which is key to either business planning or execution on construction projects or any number of things. And communication is equally involved in those activities. Same thing is true with GPS. So I'd say in the future, in the past, I think that the stumbling blocks have been financing satellites, and the long lead time it takes to do that, making sure you have the right business plan for 3 years from now, 4 years from now, not from where you are in concept phase. Doing some things where you can in advance of the satellite being available to test out the marketplace so that you validate some of your ideas where you possibly can, and to step into the business rather than trying to do the whole enchilada all at once. I think, but at the end of the day, I think there's a whole separate set of value-added business activities that derive from space-based activities, commercial, and that's taking those things that you can pull together from communication, GPS, remote sensing, and other things, and combining those, frankly, into information products or services that are quite valuable economically to nations, to countries, to individuals, both quality of life, security, safety, any number of things. And I think that's where the real growth is going to take place, and that's where the big guys will eventually want to move to, is not just in the large investments of but using the infrastructure to drive the value-added activities where there are high margins and a lot of activity potential.
To answer your question, in my experience, 10 years. And that's from concept to being in business, turning on the switch, launching, whatever. Sure.
Next question.
Well, I think one of the interesting things, the most fascinating things about XM is that it has sort of a classic, and some would say classically bad, approach of take $1.5 billion, throw it in a pot, stir vigorously, and wait 10 years. And I think it would be really instructive for this group if you could walk through kind of how you guys financed that. Because obviously the IPO was the last in a long, long string, and comment on how that might be used by some of the people in this room to help finance some of their ventures going forward.
That's a good question, Jim. And to help the 10-year answer, you're not getting a $1.5 billion the second day after you've thought about this at your desk and going forward. That takes a while. And also we, at least with XM, the IPO was in 1999, and then there was additional funding along the way. So the IPO is not the final funding. For those of you who aren't familiar with finance, you then have other kinds of funding that takes place after that as your company grows and valuations increase. But with regard to how you do it, just in a nutshell in general, then we can talk specifically about XM, but first you find people who are willing to put in just enough money to get the idea going and have a small staff. And usually that, in the space business, is my experience, it's those very large companies that probably become your vendors. So for example, with XM, we had a lot of early support from Hughes, who was looking to sell XM the satellite eventually. And that's where some of the millions, a few million, came in the beginning. And then eventually we found a strategic partner. Typically, at these kind of businesses, it's a strategic partner who will enter. That isn't as if there aren't traditional financial houses that aren't watching. I did an awful lot of talking on Wall Street in the early days with XM. People were interested, but they want to know that there are also vendors which end up being your strategic partners that believe in not only selling you a satellite, but also willing to invest in you because they buy into this business. That to me, is the critical moment when the vendor is willing to also fund you at some level, and it gives a sense that there is some legitimacy. And then you get the traditional funders come in as well at the same time usually, and then you eventually go public if that's the right thing to do. There are arguments pro and con going public, and we can talk about that too. But that is generally how I see it. Now, as far as timing goes, you do need some flashpoint events before the funding takes place. You can have your initial rounds before there are those particular events, but anyone giving serious money wants to see you meet certain milestones.
Did you have anything to add? Okay. Next. Okay, thank you. Oh, there was a sign. Wow. Sorry.
Yeah, I was following the sign. I was.
See, I can't see it.
That's why 10-year answer.
I can't see it because of the spotlight right in my face. Anyways. Okay, no one?
I just want to acknowledge that we have Courtney Stadt present, who has, I think, been instrumental over the years in the commercial space business and its formation and its evolution. And you know, there's a guy that could have easily been up here instead of me that knows a lot more about this than I do from.
And should have been here instead of me, for sure.
And he's going to get an award tonight anyway, so he shouldn't be up here. An award tonight. Come on.
Okay, thanks very much. And lunch is served.